This place takes case. Got ya. Please follow me on Instagram with the links below. Thank you. This case takes place on Norfolk Island on the 31st of March 2002. Janelle Patton was a 29-year-old woman who was born and raised in Sydney, Australia. Growing up, her parents described her as happy. She had what can be described as a normal upbringing. She did well in school, had a number of friends, and enjoyed her youth. Janelle was close with her family and she loved them dearly. When Janelle entered her late teens, she tried to find love. She had a number of relationships with different people, but sadly, none of them panned out. Her family would later say that these relationships took a toll on her. It would later come out that during her mid-20s, one of her ex-boyfriends not only cheated on her, but broke her jaw. Janelle became somewhat unsatisfied with life. As she got into her late 20s, Janelle decided that she wanted a fresh start. She spoke with her friends and family and told them that she wanted to get away. There was one place that had caught her eye for some time, a small isolated island in between her home country of Australia and New Zealand, Norfolk Island. Norfolk Island is an Australian territory which was abandoned by Polynesian seafarers in the 13th or 14th century and later rediscovered by Captain Cook in the 18th century. The island has an incredibly rich and fascinating history, which I won't go into too much detail about, but if you do have the time, you should look into it. Away from the hustle and bustle of a large city, Janelle hoped that the island could offer her a better, more peaceful life. So, she planned to move away and live on the island. During this time, the population on the island was approximately 1,800 people, with hundreds of visitors at any given time. It was an incredibly safe place to live, so safe in fact, that the last murder to happen on Norfolk Island was in the year 1893. People who lived on or visited the island described it as close to paradise as it gets. Janelle was feeling positive. She was able to get herself a job at one of the hotels on the island and moved at the age of 27. Janelle loved her new life on this quiet island. She quickly made a number of friends and began a relationship. However, this too sadly fizzled out. Following this, Janelle engaged in a number of affairs with different men, leading to a number of occasional angry encounters with local men and women. On one occasion, a woman even confronted Janelle and slapped her in the face. Janelle would keep in regular contact with her family back home in Sydney. She loved her parents and missed them a lot. It would be in 2002, 2 years after moving to Norfolk Island, that her family saved up the money to fly out and visit her. The trip was supposed to be a happy occasion, but it soon turned into an absolute nightmare. Janelle was ecstatic. Upon hearing the news that her mother and father would be visiting her new home, she began telling her colleagues and friends about how excited she was to see them. On the 30th of March 2002, Janelle's parents arrived on the island. She greeted them at the airport, gave them a tour of the island, and introduced them to her friends and colleagues. Janelle's parents stayed in a hotel, whilst she stayed in her own apartment. The following day, Janelle got up for work. The plan was that she would finish her morning and early afternoon shift at the hotel that she worked at, and then she would meet her parents for dinner at around 1 p.m. Janelle did attend work. She completed her shift, went shopping, and then went for a walk. The stills of CCTV footage on screen now are only moments before Janelle would meet a horrifically brutal end. Later on into the day, Janelle's parents got ready to meet her for dinner. She was supposed to swing by their hotel to pick them up to go out for some food, but when 1 p.m. rolled around, she was nowhere to be seen. Her parents assumed that she may just be running late, so they waited and waited, but still, Janelle didn't arrive. Her parents naturally became worried. They decided to drive to Janelle's apartment and they knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Just around Janelle's apartment, her parents bumped into one of her colleagues they had met the night before, and they asked them if they had seen Janelle anywhere recently. The colleague replied saying that she had worked with Janelle that morning, but had not seen her since. Then, moments later, Janelle's parents saw her landlord. They spoke with her and asked when they had last seen their daughter. The landlord had in fact seen Janelle at around 11:30 a.m. The landlord saw her walking along her usual morning walk, but had not seen her since. Hours went by with no word or sighting of Janelle. It was at this point, as the sun set, that the search for Janelle began. Her parents hopped into a car and they went to the police station to report their daughter missing. Unfortunately, this wouldn't happen. Unbeknownst to her parents, the body of a young woman had been found on the island. The police needed her parents to come to the station not to fill in a missing persons report, but to confirm the identity. Some locals on the island were walking when they came across a truly disturbing sight. They found the body of a young woman at the Cockpit Waterfall Reserve. The body was in a horrific state. Someone had violently attacked her and dumped her body at the waterfall. Janelle's parents were informed about the situation when they arrived at the station. They were asked if they would be able to identify the body, as they believed it was Janelle. As you can imagine, the thought of seeing their beloved daughter dead was too much, so Janelle's landlord stepped forward. She told the police that she would be able to identify Janelle. She lived just round the corner and saw her on a regular basis. Janelle's landlord entered the room to identify her. She took a look at her face and confirmed to the officers that the body was indeed Janelle. The parents were told the devastating news that their daughter was dead, and that this was a homicide investigation. As most of you watching will be aware, the vast majority of murders tend to be at the hands of someone the victim knew very well. A spouse, a family member, etc. Now of course, there was somewhat of a red flag that made the police slightly suspicious. Janelle's parents visited the island and all of a sudden, only hours after arriving, she was found dead. The police got to work right away to find out whether or not the parents were involved at all. However, they were quickly ruled out. They had absolutely no involvement whatsoever, and they understood that the police officers had to check and make sure that they weren't involved before moving forward in the case. As I said earlier, this was the first murder to occur on the island in over 100 years. The police on the island were out of their depth, and they greatly required some assistance from other departments. Crimes on the island were usually a lot less extreme. This meant that investigators from Sydney and the nation's capital Canberra were quickly sent to the island to assist the officers over there. The news of the murder spread like wildfire. A young woman brutally killed on an isolated island that is often described as paradise captivated the attention of the nation. Residents of the island were horrified. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. People trusted each other. Many began to worry that this would be the beginnings of a serial killer, a killer who wanted to target lone young women. Panic ensued as the police got to work to find the culprit and bring them to justice. The police looked to the public to gather as much evidence as possible. They asked everyone to come forward with information regarding the case. If anyone was near to where Janelle's body was found around the time of the murder, they wanted to know. Now, this part is something that I found to be very eerie. Some teenagers came forward. They told the police that they had been in the area where Janelle's body was found. They had been playing around, using surfboards to slide down the wet, grassy hill, and one of the teenagers had filmed the whole time with a camera recorder. This camera recorder was handed in to the police. When investigators analysed the footage given to them by the teenagers, they made a haunting discovery. Janelle's plastic-bound body could be seen in the background as they slid down the hill. These teenagers had absolutely no idea. As they were having fun, they were mere meters away from a murder victim. I can imagine that it left the teenagers rather disturbed too. A man also came forward with some information, as he heard a woman scream. The scream was heard by a man by the name of Arthur Keeping. Arthur was at the Norfolk Island Golf Club at around 11:20 a.m. when he suddenly heard what he described as a high-pitched scream. He would later say, "It sounded like it was coming from a distance. It was a continual scream. It seemed to go on for around 30 seconds or so." Unfortunately, Arthur did not investigate as to where the scream was coming from, nor did he seek any help. Only hours later, Janelle's body would be found in the general area of where the scream was coming from. Other witnesses who were also in the area around the time when Janelle was killed also came forward. They recalled seeing a white car with 4 doors. This would be something that would later help the police in their investigation. A post-mortem was conducted on Janelle's body, which gave the investigators an idea of what happened to her, and what they found was unbelievably horrific. Janelle's body was found on the opposite side of the island from where she was last seen by her landlord, and she was found wrapped in a black plastic sheet. One thing was clear: Janelle fought back, and she fought back incredibly hard, although the attack she suffered was violent and sustained. Someone had attacked her with a knife, and during the struggle, she grabbed onto the blade. This resulted in the part of the hand between the thumb and index finger being hacked through, to the point that her thumb was almost totally severed. The top of the skin on her head appeared to be torn. Her pelvis and ankle were broken. Pieces of glass and small flakes of paint were found in Janelle's hair and scalp. It seemed that she had been struck in the head with a glass bottle. She had a total of 67 stab wounds, with deep lacerations all over her body. Her body was also completely covered in bruises, and it seemed like whoever had done this had repeatedly struck her with some kind of metallic pole. It also seemed from Janelle's wrists that she had been restrained. Her face had deep cuts all across it, and she had been stabbed through her eye. The weapon had been plunged into her eye with such force that it fractured her skull. But this isn't what killed her. She died from a stab wound to the chest, and this punctured her lung. Janelle's final moments were incredibly brutal and horrific, and she bravely fought her attacker until the bitter end. With such a brutal murder, the police wanted this solved as swiftly as possible. The odds were in their favour. After all, the island is rather secluded, and the borders are tightly regulated. The police had the names of every single visitor and resident on that island within the day, and were looking into their backgrounds to see if any of them fit the profile of a killer. 2,271 people to be exact, with a few hundred of those being visitors. They believed that whoever was responsible for the crime would be a visitor. There was a slight issue. The day that Janelle was killed, there was torrential rain. The rain fell whilst her body was outside and wrapped in the plastic. This caused some potential DNA evidence to be destroyed and washed away. Although not everything would be washed away by the storm. Investigators found a number of fingerprints on the plastic sheet that was used to cover Janelle with. The police were now on to something. Because the island was so small, the police asked everyone to come forward willingly and give over their fingerprints, so they would be able to eliminate any innocent person. Those on the island were deeply disturbed by the murder, and they wanted the case solved as swiftly as possible and for the killer to be brought to justice, so a majority of the residents of the island were happy to oblige with the police, giving samples of their DNA and fingerprints to the desperate officers. Although some residents did refuse to come forward, believing that the police were using the murder as an opportunity to gather evidence for ulterior motives. The police were hoping that this would bring an end to the case, as people on the island were beginning to point fingers at each other and tensions started to rise. As more evidence gathered, it resulted in 16 persons of interest, 16 potential people who could be responsible for the gruesome murder of Janelle. All of them were residents of the island, despite their initial beliefs that whoever had done this was an outsider. The state then issued a reward of $300,000 to anyone who could offer information that would lead to the capture of the person responsible. But all of this led to nothing. The 16 persons of interest were ruled out. Investigators once thought that this case would be quickly solved due to the size of the island. Surely someone knew something, or surely someone had talked to someone. In such a small and close-knit community, it was baffling that the killer was still on the loose. By 2004, 2 years after the murder, there was no fingerprint match and no prime suspect. So, an inquest was held. During this inquest, private details about Janelle's life were shared to the public, details that seemed somewhat controversial to share. Snippets of her diary entries were read out, where it came to light that Janelle had been physically attacked and emotionally manipulated by a number of men in her life before moving to the island to get away. It also came out that Janelle had serious issues with her self-esteem, and she battled these insecurities with antidepressants and alcohol. It also transpired that in the weeks before her murder, Janelle had complained of a late-night prowler near her home, and that on one occasion, it seemed that someone had actually gone into her home and gone through her underwear drawer. The inquest also delved into the numerous turbulent affairs that Janelle had with men on the island. However, shortly after the inquest, a breakthrough would soon come. The police began looking into a man by the name of Glenn McNeil. He had been involved in a burglary, and his prints were on file. Glenn was a chef from New Zealand and had been working on the island for 2 years by the time that Janelle was murdered. But 6 weeks after her death, he flew back to New Zealand and hadn't returned, despite him leaving his then-girlfriend at the time. The fingerprints were cross-examined, and they were a match. However, this wasn't 100% confirmation that he was the killer. After all, who knows where this plastic sheet could have come from? The killer could have found it anywhere and used it, and it could have been touched by almost anyone. Also, there were other fingerprints on the plastic sheet, fingerprints that weren't Glenn's. As I mentioned earlier, some witnesses did come forward, saying that they had seen a white car around the time of Janelle's murder. Well, Glenn just so happened to have that very same car that the witnesses recalled seeing. The police were fairly certain that he had something to do with the murder, but they needed much more evidence. They began searching for the car that Glenn had previously owned, a white Honda Civic. They asked the residents of the island if they had seen such a car, and it wouldn't take long for it to be found. Glenn had abandoned his white Honda Civic on a private plot of land before leaving the island, and the vehicle had remained abandoned until 2005. Investigators carried out forensic analysis on the Honda Civic, which revealed small glass particles and flakes of paint. These were the very same glass particles and paint flakes that were found in Janelle's scalp. Human hairs were also discovered in the boot of the car, which matched with Janelle's DNA. The police also discovered the other prints on the plastic sheet. The prints belonged to a man by the name of Steve Cochran. When Glenn lived on the island, he lived right opposite a place called Little Cutter's Corn. Well, Steve Cochran was employed on 2 building sites on the island. One of them was right on Little Cutter's Corn. Glenn had taken the sheet from the building site and used it to wrap up Janelle's body. With so much evidence now pointing towards Glenn, the police obtained a warrant for his arrest and extradition from New Zealand on the charge of murder. On the 1st of February 2006, the warrant was endorsed and Glenn was taken into custody. Whilst in custody, he was interviewed by Detective Sergeant Robert Peters. The detective told Glenn that the game was over. Forensic evidence had been collected, which strongly linked him to the crime. He told him to come clean. Glenn then explained to the detective that he had accidentally run over Janelle's body and then panicked. He claimed he placed her body into the boot of his car and then drove back to his flat. When he got back to his flat, he retrieved a knife and returned to the boot of his car. It's at this point that he began to stab and hack at her body, just to make sure that she was dead. He said that he stabbed her after he heard her making muffled sounds from the boot, and he did this because he had gone too far. He said he then went out the back and obtained a sheet of plastic from a building site and wrapped her body up in the plastic. He then drove to Cockpit Reserve where he left her body. He said he cleaned the boot of his car and threw the knife into the ocean. After the interview was completed, he wrote a handwritten statement in which he expressed his remorse. Here is that statement.
It was just an accident. I was just driving along the road and I dropped my smokes. I bent down to pick them up and I hit her. At first, I thought I'd hit a cow or a dog. I got out and saw that she was under the car and I panicked. She wasn't moving or making any noise, and I thought she was dead. Ever since that day, I've thought about what I have done. It has affected me, my family, and others. I have experienced depression thinking about what happened that morning. I have tried to take my own life on many occasions to make up for that day. I am sorry to the parents. I would never want anything to happen to my children or partner. It makes me sick and sad to even think about what I have done, and my only wish is to do what is right. I can't keep thinking on about this every day, it's making me sick. It has been my worry ever since I left Norfolk. Since that day, everything has gone wrong, until I had my first child, but I still had the burden of knowing what really happened in Norfolk. It has, and always will, affect me deeply, as it has her parents. I wish that it never happened, and I kept my eyes on the road. I will live with this forever. So will my family and my kids growing up not knowing me. I will always be sorry, and I will always hurt.
Finally, the police had a confession to go along with the evidence, with some details that only the killer could have known. But there was a problem. It just didn't make any sense. His account of what happened just didn't line up with the injuries that Janelle had sustained. Not to mention that the medical evidence didn't show that Janelle had been involved in a collision. It was obvious that Glenn was lying. He came clean about the fact that he killed Janelle, but he was trying to downplay the brutal and callous nature of what actually happened. Janelle had been in a violent struggle, a struggle where she fought for her life. This was no accident. It was clear that Glenn was just trying to protect himself and was hoping to get a more lenient sentence in court now that he knew he had been caught by the police. Investigators told Glenn that they knew he was lying. There was overwhelming evidence that his version of events was untrue, but he continued to stick to his story, assuring the police that this was just some terrible accident. Glenn was arrested and charged with the murder of Janelle. 5 years after the murder, the trial would take place. But as the trial was about to begin, Glenn changed his story. He retracted his previous confession and now claimed that at the time of his confession he was seriously mentally ill and was having issues with illegal substances and alcohol. He claimed that he couldn't even remember talking to the police, and said that he would have admitted to anything due to his mental health at the time. When speaking about the confession tape, he said that he likely just told the police what they wanted to hear, and that it was totally rubbish, adding that even he was shocked by what he said. He now denied that he killed or abducted Janelle, and that he did not know how his fingerprints came to be on the black plastic. Although the jury of 11 didn't believe his story, Glenn was found guilty of the murder of Janelle and was sentenced to 24 years with a minimum term of 18. But this isn't the end of the story. After being in prison for a number of years, Glenn changed his story yet again. This time, he claimed that he was totally innocent of the murder, but that he was involved in disposing of Janelle's body. He claims that Janelle was actually killed by a drug-dealing criminal couple who forced Glenn into disposing of her body. Glenn said that this criminal couple accused him of stealing from them and that they threatened to harm Glenn and his family if he did not do exactly as they said. Glenn claimed that this couple showed him Janelle's body in the back of their ute and demanded that he dispose of her, no questions asked. He said he became scared and did as he was told, but decided to place Janelle's body in an obvious spot so she would be found quickly. He also claimed that when he was handling the black plastic, he used surgical gloves, and that he buried these gloves near his home on the island. Investigators did search the area that Glenn claimed to have buried these gloves, but they found no new evidence. The criminal couple were named by Glenn, and phone records did show that he did have a connection to them in the weeks before and after the murder. The names of the couple have not been released to the public, and I'm unaware if they have ever been interviewed by the police. The police do not believe his story, and have called it a desperate act, and an attempt by Glenn to absolve himself of any responsibility. Since this, nothing more has really come of the case. In total, Glenn has told around 4 or 5 different stories now, some of which I have mentioned in this video, and some of which I have not. It is possible that he will tell another story in the future, but the one I have just told is the most recent. But here is where it gets strange. It seemed that Janelle had been restrained, and it seemed like the cuts to her face were done whilst Janelle was conscious but being held still, like someone was restraining her hands and face and using the knife to torture her. Some experts have said that this proves that other people were involved. However, I do believe that if one person were to get on top of Janelle and use their knees to pin her arms down, they would be able to hold her head in place and cut her face. The official investigators who worked on the case believed that only one person was responsible for the murder of Janelle, and came to this conclusion from the injuries she had sustained. But some independent experts have looked at the evidence and have come to a different conclusion. They believe that more than one person was involved. Also, Janelle's pelvis was broken, and how this happened is still somewhat of a mystery. It isn't clear to the investigators exactly how this happened. And finally, none of Glenn's DNA was actually found on Janelle's body, but the DNA of an unidentified woman was. To this day, this woman has never been identified. It wasn't any of her friends, family members, or anyone mentioned in her diary. As of right now, Glenn has been released from prison and is living in Christchurch, New Zealand. He is currently on parole and has to wear an electronic tag at all times. He has no prior history of violence, and according to the prison, he was well behaved at all times whilst serving his sentence. People are divided by the outcome. Some believe Glenn's story, and that other people were involved. They believe the police should pursue his story further. But others do not. They believe that Glenn is a cold-blooded killer who killed Janelle in the most brutal murder the island has ever seen. Many who look into this case liken it to a murder mystery novel, with many twists, turns, and unanswered questions. At the time of recording, no one else has been charged with the murder of Janelle Patton.